Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my January wrap-up. In January I read 11 books. One of them I technically finished in February, but I started it in January and I finished it right at the beginning of February, so I'm counting it anyway. January was actually a big month of rereads for me. 4 of the books that I read were rereads, which for me, 4 is quite a few rereads just for all in one month. But I have really been enjoying rereading books, and there are a lot of ones that I wanted to get through, and it was a nice way to kind of start off the year with some that I knew I would like. There was one that I kind of knew I wasn't going to like, but I wanted to try anyway. We'll get into that. So the first book that I read in January was Uprooted by Naomi Novik. I like to start off my year usually with either a book by an author that I already know I love, or a reread that I know that I have loved before to kind of start the year off on the right foot, and this is a reread that I loved the first time that I read it. This is a fairy tale style book. Some people say that it is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. I don't really think that it's a retelling of anything, but it definitely has a very fairy tale feel. In this story, we follow Agnieszka, who lives in a valley that is bordered by a malevolent forest, which they call the Wood. And the Wood is always trying to corrupt the people of the valley and to kill them and just expand its borders, and it has this very like malevolent consciousness to it. In the valley they also have the dragon, who is not actually a dragon, he is a wizard that lives in the tower but protects the people of the valley from the Wood. But every 10 years he comes down to the valley and takes one of the local girls to live with him in his tower for 10 years. And this book starts on one of those years when the dragon comes down to the village and takes one of the girls. And that's what starts off this book. And this is one that the first time I read it, I absolutely loved it. It just like swept me off my feet. I couldn't put it down when I read it. And it's not perfect. There were some problems that I had, but there was so much about it that I loved so much that I like didn't even care about any problems it may have had. And reading it again, I really loved rereading it. I think I was not quite as swept away this time as I was the first time that I read it, just because it wasn't new to me, but I still really enjoyed it the second time around. I love the magic that's in it. It has very like intuitive magic. You know, a lot of times we talk a lot about very structured magic systems, but then I also really love those kind of like intuitive, feely kind of magic that's less about like, are they following this specific structure and system, and more about like, what does the magic feel like? And that's more what the magic in this is like, and I really enjoy that. I love how the magic is also very related to nature and the forest and everything like that. So, and those are always themes that I love. One of the things that I also loved about rereading this is that I got some of my questions answered, because there are some things that this book doesn't explain as thoroughly as I would like, but some of the questions that I had from my first read were answered in my reread, because the first time I was reading this, I read it so fast and I was just like flying through it because I was so enthralled that I didn't really notice some of the details of it, and then that left me with questions. And rereading it, there were answers to some of those questions that I just hadn't seen before, because a lot of the like answers I was looking for were usually pretty like subtle and just kind of mixed in with other information. And this time reading the book, since it's my second time, I was looking for those answers, and since I was reading more slowly and carefully, I could pick up on them. So I really liked that some of it doesn't explain things as like in detail as a lot of other books, so that might bother some people, but it definitely answered a lot of the questions that I had about this. One of the things that I don't love about this book is the romance that's in it, because it's a trope that always bothers me. The romance in general I feel like is very unnecessary, and it just kind of feels like it comes out of nowhere, and I just am like, why is this even here? But also it has this trope of you know, one of the people in the relationship is like this magical creature or has some kind of magic that makes them live for a long time, but they still look young, and then the other person is actually young in like human years. And essentially it goes like, oh, but like this person who's like centuries old, they look young, like the two of them look like they're the same age, so it's fine. And I hate this trope so much. But a relationship that I do really love from this book is the friendship between our main character Agnieszka and her best friend Kasia. And the two of them have such a wonderful friendship. These two girls are so close and they're so dedicated to each other, and the two of them, like, they will never abandon each other and they will walk through fire for each other. And I love their friendship so much, and I really would have liked more about the two of them. I think the romance in this book like just didn't need to be there, but I would have loved like even more about Agnieszka and Kasia's friendship. So this one, I do really enjoy this book. It's not perfect, it has some issues, but it's so fun, and I love the like nature magic and nature just feel of it. And I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It was a really fun reread to start off my year. The next book that I read was a nonfiction audiobook, which was The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. And this is about tipping points and how something like a trend, it can be like all of these little things that lead up to something becoming a huge trend that just like sweeps a culture or a society or community or whatever it is, how information is passed and how these kinds of trends are started. And it was interesting. This wasn't a nonfiction that I felt like really blew me away, but it was definitely fun to listen to. It was very quick also as an audiobook, so I had a fun time reading it. I probably will be reading more of Malcolm Gladwell's books because, as I said, it was really fun. It was interesting to hear his take on like how all of this happens. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this is that he talks about all of the different people and like the different like parts that they play in making a trend happen. Like the people who are the innovators, who are doing the things that are the most like out there and different. Then there are the people who are the translators, who see what the innovators are doing but translate it in such a way they kind of put their own twist on it to make it more palatable to the rest of the general public. Then they're like the early adopters and then the late adopters and the people who kind of lag behind. But it was really interesting to see how he kind of broke down all of these different roles that different people play in this whole process. And I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read In an Absent Dream by Seanan McGuire. It just came out in January, so I got it and like almost immediately read it. This is the 4th book in the Wayward Children series, which is a series of novellas about kids who have traveled to magical worlds and then come back to our world and may have trouble readjusting to these to our world after having been in these magical portal worlds. This is the backstory to a character that we very briefly met in the 1st book of the Wayward Children series, who is named Lundy. And in this, she goes to the Goblin Market. Of the 4 books in this series, this is one of my favorites. I really love the first one, In an Absent Dream, and then the 2 middle ones are kind of just so for me, but I really loved this one as well. Every book in this series tends to have kind of a moral of the story for each book. It has something that it focuses on, and some of them are a little more heavy-handed than others. That's a lot of times my complaint about these. Not that I don't like the moral of the story that they include, because I like the moral of the story that they have, and I'm glad and I'm really happy that they have them in there. I just think sometimes they are a little heavy-handed with it, a little bit like shoving it in your face too much to the point that it gets distracting and kind of annoying. But this one I think was a little less heavy-handed with it, and I really enjoyed that about it. It made it easier to just be part of the story instead of feeling like I was being taken out of the story to be lectured at. I also really like the setting of the Goblin Market. I thought it was very interesting, and I actually would have liked more about it. There's a lot in this of going back and forth between like our world and the Goblin Market world, and there were large time jumps in this where they would kind of reference adventures that the characters had gone on and like quests that they had and things like that. And I understand that those quests weren't really the point of this story, but they always sounded so interesting, and I really, really wish that we had gotten to see more of those quests and more of the Goblin Market world. So I did really enjoy this one. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It really was one that it left me wanting more. My complaint was that I wanted more of it. The next book that I read was a book of poetry, which was Light Theory and the Darkness Within the Human Body by Robert M. Drake. And this is a poetry book that I kind of picked up at random. I was at a Barnes & Noble and just saw it, flipped through it. There were a couple of poems that seemed interesting, so I thought I'd try it. I'm still kind of trying to figure out what it is I like or don't like in poetry, so I kind of try things randomly. And this one was okay. It didn't blow me away. There were a couple of poems that I enjoyed from it, but overall I think it just didn't suit me. I don't necessarily think it was bad in any way, but it's not the kind of poetry that I'm looking for. This poetry focuses a lot on the idea of brokenness and like the beauty of brokenness, and this idea that you kind of have to be broken and feel pain in order to live your life truthfully, in order to find who you have to be broken in order to find who you truly are. You have to be broken in order to experience like the reality of life, or like life as it truly is. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because it was fine, but not really for me. Then I read another nonfiction audiobook, which was Originals: How Nonconformists Move the World by Adam Grant. This is a book that I needed to read for work because we are going through a big change, and the person who's kind of managing this whole change is really into this idea of like us being like innovators and being really different. And I don't know if I like agree with his whole vision for it, but we'll see how this pans out. But he had these books that he wants us to read. This one, and there's one other book, but I found the audiobook for this one, so this is the one that got read first. We'll see what happens with the other. Anyways, so this is a book about people who are original, like what makes people be original or be innovators or be creative, or like make strides in that way. This is another one that I thought was just okay. There were some interesting points to it. It's the kind of nonfiction where he kind of has like one point and then he tells you a million stories to make that one point. So sometimes it gets kind of repetitive and exhausting. One of the problems I had with this book was that some of the evidence that he referenced was not always clear to me how the evidence was come to, or how legitimate the research was. Sometimes he would make statements that I was like, where is this information coming from? Are you just saying a theory, or is this like actually evidence-based information? He had some interesting theories, some interesting points and information, but I didn't always trust the source or the rigorousness of the science that he was referencing. So I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. It was kind of forgettable. I don't feel like I got a lot, but it wasn't terrible to just like, you know, listen to the audiobook. So my battery died and I had to stop to charge it. So the angle might be slightly different, but we'll just keep going. So the next book that I read was an audiobook, and it was a reread for me, which was The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This book, the first time that I read it, like 2 years ago, I wasn't a huge fan of it. I think I gave it like 3 stars. It was very like to me, but I did want to continue the series. I have the second book and I want to read it, and I wanted to give the second book, you know, the best chance that it has for me to like it. So I want to reacquaint myself with the story. I didn't want to just not like the second book only because I couldn't remember what happened in the first book. So I listened to the audiobook of this to just reacquaint myself with it, and as I listened to it, I realized that there was a reason that I did not like it the first time, and I liked it even less upon rereading it. So I know that this is actually a very popular book, or at least it's one that the people who read it, like I only hear good things about it for the most part. So I am gonna go a little bit on a rant about this book because I did not enjoy this one. So if you don't want to hear me rant about it, you can just like skip over this part. I agree with my original assessment of this, which was that it's too heavy on like the Russian history and too light on the fantasy. It goes into a lot of detail of like who's marrying who and what are all like the politics, and the politics are not really relevant to the story. They're just kind of like backstory to explain how these characters ended up all in the same place at the same time. But it's information that's like really unnecessary, and it could have been much more concise. And I really wanted much more of the fantastical elements, much more of the folklore elements to it. And it really I didn't get that, especially until like the end of the book. In general, the first like 2/3 of this book, nothing happens. Like just nothing. And it's not even that it's like a slow-paced book, because I love a good slow-paced book. It's not slow-paced. Nothing happens for the first 2/3. And I could not stand the main character. She has little to no personality. Her entire personality is eye contact, because really her whole personality is just like she walks in the woods by herself and she makes eye contact with men instead of looking down demurely like she should. And like, I get it that maybe that's, you know, for the time period that this is set in, that's just wild to them. But that doesn't like make a character, you know? Making eye contact is not a full character, and that's pretty much the only thing about her. And then of course the entire story or non-story is just everybody flipping out about her making eye contact with people. They're just like, she walks in the woods by herself and she makes eye contact with people. Can't have that. Everybody flips out. Obviously she must be like evil or possessed or like bringing the devil down upon them or whatever it is. And so they cannot stand that. But of course they're also like weirdly obsessed with her. Like everybody is obsessed with her because she's not like other girls. She's so special and different and wild and free. But also we can't have that. She's just like obviously evil because of all of those things. So we have to squash her and control her. But she's not like that different or anything other than eye contact. And it's just this like such like, that doesn't make a story, you know? Like everybody flipping out over the fact that she makes eye contact, that's not a story. And like nothing happens for most of the book. And of course there's also like this really creepy monk who is also obsessed with her. He's also like kind of attracted to her. He has like a weird sex dream about her at one point. And then of course that leads him to go, well, she must be evil because I'm a man of God and I'm attracted to her. So clearly she's an evil seductress who, you know, is spawn of the devil or something like that. I don't know. And again, that's not like a compelling storyline to me, or at least not as like a main motivator. That could maybe be like, you know, like a side motivation to something, but that was like the primary motivation for this character and this plot. And again, that's not a story. And along with this like monk that was really obsessed with her and some other like very religious characters, religious fanaticism was a big like theme and motivator for this book and this story. And I think that that might be a plot motivation that could have worked in some context, but I don't think that it worked in this context. I don't think that it was there was not robust enough reasoning for the things that happened. Also for me, when I am reading a book with religious fanaticism as a like central plot point and motivation, I really prefer for it to be a fictional religion. I don't like with real religions from like our world, I don't think that I think it's very hard to do it well. I also just generally don't find it as compelling. There's a lot of like layers and baggage and things that go along with it, and I think it's just very hard to do it in a way that the story isn't weighed down by all of that like real world context that we have as a reader if it was going to really dive into these themes of religious fanaticism, which again, I don't think it really then even dove in enough. It kept it kind of surface level to me, and then it felt like it wasn't a good enough motivation for anything that happened in the story. So it was kind of a double-edged sword for me, that it did it too much in some respects, and also too little in some respects. And it just, I think it's very difficult to do it really well, especially with a real world religion like this. And I just don't really enjoy real world religious fanaticism. So I believe the first time I read this book, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. This time I gave it 2 out of 5 stars because it really reinforced for me why I disliked this book. I'm not giving up on this series, but even though I went into this book with low expectations because I already knew that I was not a fan of it, it still managed to disappoint me. The next book that I read was another reread for me, which was The Raven King by Maggie Stiefvater. This is the last book in the Raven cycle, and this is one of my favorite series of all time. I love these books. I love these characters so much. This is a series that, like, I get is like, it's not for everybody, but I love it so much. Maggie Stiefvater's writing, her strengths are really in her characters and in the atmosphere of her writing, but plot is not always her strength, and for me, like, characters are the most important thing, so that works just fine for me. And with how much I love these characters, I just absolutely adore this series. This series is always incredibly hard to explain what it is about. It follows a group of friends who are searching for a dead Welsh king. There is a story that he's not actually dead, he's asleep, and if you can wake him, that he will grant you a wish. And so they have been searching for a very long time for this king, and this is kind of the end of the road for them, the end of that search. I loved rereading this series so much because I really was much more aware of how these characters have grown over time and over the course of this series, because they really do grow so much. And going into this reread, I was a little bit worried that, so my favorite character from this series is Adam Parrish. Like, I love that kid so much. And I was a little concerned that if I reread it, he may not, like, stay my favorite. And for the first 2 books, I was like, oh no, he may not be my favorite. Like, what's gonna happen? But somewhere along the way in the 3rd and 4th book, I don't know when exactly, but like, he just came back to, like, win my heart again, and I'm like, yes, this is why he is my favorite. I can't really explain why I love him so much, but, like, he's just a character that I love so much, and he just makes my heart hurt, and I just, like, this is just gonna be unintelligible. Like, I don't know. It's amazing. I loved this book. I loved this reread. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. This was my first 5-star read of the year. Like, yes, it was a reread, but still, love it so much. The next thing that I read was Alternative Lives, which is a book of poetry by Constance Erdang. And this one, like, it only has 2 ratings on Goodreads, and it has like 2 stars. So I was like, oh, like, I don't know how this is gonna go. I just kind of picked it up randomly at a used bookstore like a year ago or something like that. And it was okay. I actually didn't rate it because I wasn't really sure how to rate it or how I felt about it. It was just very, it almost didn't even feel like poetry to me when I was reading it, and I just didn't know what to think of it, so I just didn't rate it. Then I read another book of poetry, which was Dog Songs by Mary Oliver. And this is a collection of Mary Oliver's poetry all about dogs. And this book, I started reading it on the train on my commute home from work, and very quickly realized this is not a commuting book because I started tearing up on the train. I am not a big, like, crier in general, but dogs are one of those things that get me every time. And there are a lot of poems in here about, like, one, just like how much she loves her dogs. Some of them are written from the perspective of the dogs, and then there are a lot that are like about dogs of hers that have died, and I just was like, oh my god, I should not have started reading this in public because I started tearing up on the train. So I really enjoyed this book, and it is very moving if you are a dog person. If you're not a dog person, I don't know if you'd like it as much, but as a dog person, I really, like, it's sad, but it is very moving, and I really appreciated it and how much it was just about, like, the goodness of dogs. But, like, don't read it in public maybe if you don't want to, like, start crying in public. Just FYI. But I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. And then the last 2 books that I read this month were both audiobooks, and the second one I actually finished like at the beginning of February, but we're counting it in my January because I started it in January, which were the first 2 books in the Artemis Fowl series. This is a series that I never knew anything about until just recently because everybody is talking about it. Apparently, I think they're making, like, is it a movie or a TV show of it? There's a new book in the series being published. There are a couple different, like, read-alongs going on for the series, so I thought I would give it a try because it is one that a lot of people apparently really love and was really important to, like, their childhood reading and everything like that. So this is a middle grade series about a criminal mastermind who is, I think, like 12 or 13, and his big, like, mastermind plan is to kidnap a fairy and hold it for ransom. And so it is a really interesting mix of, like, magic and technology. It does have fairies, and, like, there's a centaur and there are elves and goblins and all of this, but their worlds are their world is very funny in that it's very mundane. It's not very fantastical. It mirrors our world in a lot of ways, and I definitely enjoyed reading these. I wasn't, you know, blown away by them, but I think they were a lot of fun. I think I gave both of them 3.5 stars because, yeah, they were just really fun. I am interested to see where the series goes. I do want to continue listening to the series. The main character, Artemis, actually kind of reminds me of a middle grade version of Kaz Brecker from Six of Crows, how he is kind of this, like, this mastermind, and he is very willing to do, like, anything he has to achieve his ends, and he's always, like, you know, 5 steps ahead of everybody else, and the way that he makes plans and, like, orchestrates people, and I don't know, there was just a lot about him that reminded me of that character. And as I said, I listened to the first 2. The first one is just called Artemis Fowl. The second one is called The Arctic Incident, and I gave both of them 3.5 stars. So those are all the books that I finished in January, and then I also started my reread of The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. There is a read-along, that's the Hunger Along, that is going on where they read 1 book from the series each month, January, February, and March. And I got started a little bit late, but in January I got about halfway through The Hunger Games, and I'm gonna finish it up soon and continue with the series, reading Catching Fire in February, and I'll have more about this in my February wrap-up. So those are all of the books that I read in January. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!